Tisha B'Av is the saddest day in the Jewish calendar, a day in which we commemorate many tragedies that took place on this day throughout Jewish history. On Tisha B'Av, both the first and the second temple were destroyed, and we pray for the rebuilding of the temple every day in our tefillot. However, it can often be something very difficult for us to connect to. It just seems like a building that existed so long ago, a time period that was so long ago. We are lucky to be joined by Tzvi Sperber of JRoots as we tour through the Old City and bring the history of Jerusalem to life and make this a meaningful Tisha B'Av.
So welcome to Jerusalem. My name is Tzvi from JRoots, and it's a privilege to be here with US TV. You know, as we come here to the area of Yerushalayim, which of course today we're dealing with the 9th of Av, the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the first and the second temple, and so many other events that took place on this day. But you have to dig down to understand what really happened here. We're standing at the present moment in the Jewish quarter, and under everyone's house in the Jewish quarter is archaeology. It's an incredible thing, because as you dig down layer by layer by layer, you're starting to pick out what took place here. What happened? What was the story? What period am I dealing with? Am I in the period of Chizkiyahu? Am I in the period of Sikiyahu? Am I in the period of Yirmiyahu? What period am I in? Am I in the period of the Second Temple period? Where am I? Every period tells a different story. Today we're going to visit two sites here. They're hopefully for us to understand the concept of the Churban, of the destruction. But at the same time, that concept of never losing faith and never losing hope. So as we said, so much is hidden from us and so much is underground. We spoke about the idea that underneath everyone's house, there's a whole story. And you can see that quite clearly here. You know, they would have liked to have built in this area and every area, but there are certain things they said, you know what, we can't do. We can't build. And the reason is because of this. I'm standing actually on the wall, which you can see off to my left-hand side. There's a line and there's another line over here. In effect, where I am now is right outside the First Temple period Jerusalem. This wall was built for First Temple period Jerusalem. And you can see that now over here. The wall was very high. The estimated height of the wall, you can see on this building over here, Plugat HaKotel. But what's the story here and why is it so important to us? We focus so often on this idea of what took place when the temple was destroyed in the Churban Beit HaMikdash, of the second temple of Sinat Chinam, of baseless hatred. But we can't forget what took place in the first temple. It's just like when we deal with modern day history. Today we deal with so much of what took place in the second war that we forget sometimes what happened in the First World War. Here is another story, a story that we need to be connected to. And again, the beauty of standing in places like this is I can take out my Tanakh, open it up and read the story. It talks about it in Divrei Yamim, in the Book of Chronicles, as well as other places. But we're standing on a wall that Chizkiyahu HaMelech had built. King Hezekiah. The wall itself was built here in order to be able to protect Jerusalem. Remember, where am I now in the concept of the city? If I'm facing this way, I'm facing towards the west, but if I'm this way, I'm facing towards the north. It says in the Tanakh, Mitzafon tipatach ra'ah, from the north evil comes. And that was the same case of the time period that we're dealing with. Now we know Chizkiyahu stood his ground. Because where are we is the story of Sancherib, who comes to destroy First Temple Jerusalem. Talking about the 8th century. Chizkiyahu demands that a wall is built in order to protect the city. And you can see how wide this wall is. In the Tanakh it says they counted the houses in the wall. And if we look down, there are houses in the wall over here. Nobody really understood that piece of the Tanakh until we found the wall. Because when we talk about the idea of counting the houses, we thought, well, maybe they were the shomrim, the guards, the people in the houses. But no, it seems like to count the houses was the idea of understanding how much compensation I have to give to the people whose houses I'm destroying. They stood here in trepidation. As Sancherib came here with his 180,000 soldiers to Jerusalem, as the Tanakh tells us. Incredible amount of people that are arriving here. They have destroyed 46 cities in their wake as they come to Jerusalem, trampled on all of Yehuda. Jerusalem at this time will triple-fold in size in order to be able to get in all of the refugees here. The destruction is upon them. But Chizkiyahu has not given up. Yes, Chizkiyahu puts his shomrim, his guards, on the walls to get ready for battle. But at the same time, he knows his other conduit is still open. And that concept of Sharei D'ma'ot Lo Nin'alu, the gates of tears, the gates of tefillah, are never locked to the Jewish people. He understands that he still has the option to be able to utilize that. After him praying and bringing back this concept of tshuva, of repentance to the Jewish people for their wrongdoings, the decree is overturned. And we're standing now in a place where we have to remember something as well incredible. It says on the night of the passing angel, on the night of Pesach, it speaks about the idea that Chizkiyahu's tefillot came true. Sancheriv's troops, a plague ran throughout the whole area of Sancheriv's troops, and they left, if you want, with their tail between their legs. It's an amazing thing when you dig up in Israel and you start to be able to find different pieces of the story that was written to us in the Tanakh. Go to Lachish, you find the stele that they found there. Sancheriv writes there that he manages to destroy 46 cities. He gets to Chizkiyahu, and what does it say about Chizkiyahu? He had him like a bird in the cage, locked up in this cage that he wasn't able to do anything. That cage was Yerushalayim. Sancheriv thought that the cage itself meant that the person would crumble. But as you know, cages have holes between the bars. There's always a possibility. Nothing is locked, and there's always a possibility to overturn. During Chizkiyahu's time, they managed, if you want, to escape that decree of destruction. But it will take place, unfortunately, in the First Temple period, 200 years later. 586 BCE will be the destruction of the First Temple. And today we happen to be filming here on the eve of the 9th of Tammuz. The 9th of Tammuz is the day the Babylonians broke through the walls of Jerusalem and entered in past these walls that you see over here, the same walls that we spoke about of Chizkiyahu, entered into Yerushalayim to start their final conquest on the destruction of Jerusalem during the First Temple period. You know, a people that have gone through the First Temple, a people that unfortunately been taken off to Galut, to exile, after being slaughtered in the streets as well. Gone to Babylon. Some people then went to Mitzrayim, to Egypt. That people loses hope? Well, if you think that that's the Jewish story, you've never met the Jewish people. Because Jews, the word of hope, or should I say the word of despair, isn't part of our lexicon. Hope is what we all believe in. That concept that we can rebuild ourselves. And we managed to come back here to have a glorious amount of time within the Second Temple. But unfortunately, that story will happen again. We're going to go and visit a site to deal with the Second Temple now. Come this way. Yerushalayim is a layer of history after a layer of history. You know, when you're digging Yerushalayim, it's very hard to understand what layer you're actually going to hit. You have to go down from one layer to the other, and then finally you might reach the layer that you want to deal with. As you come down from the main streets of the old city, you come down to this layer over here, which is dealing with Second Temple period. The period that so much of our kinot on Tisha B'Av, of our lamentations and our prayers on Tisha B'Av on the 9th of Av deal with. You come down to see the destruction of an unbelievable city. But where are we in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem? So of course, we're not down by the Kotel, because I'm sure that many of you have walked around that area. But we're up in what was known as the upper city. The city itself was divided into the lower city and the upper city. The lower city was mainly where the city of David today stands, and the upper city is where we are at the present moment. As you can expect, the upper city looked very different to the lower city. The people who were living here were very different to those people who were living in the lower city too. Jerusalem was so divided in the time of the Second Temple. It was divided between the Canaim, between the Zealots. It was divided between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. It was very divided. We also had another group that I'm sure very familiar to many of you called the Essenes. Many of them had left before the time period that we're dealing with, which is 70 CE, the time of the destruction of the temple. They had gone to various places, including probably the most famous of their strongholds, that being Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. But when you come to the place over here, in the upper city, and you start to dig piece after piece, putting together a story of who lived here, you can see from these major jars that we have over here, storing grain, and we have amphora, which were the wine jars that had a little peak at the bottom that the sediment would also fall into, and also was able to stand properly. You don't find them usually in one piece. And just like you have to put together the piece of the jug to give it its frame, give it its shape, we too, when we come to deal with the story of the Second Temple period, we're taking one piece after the other, putting them together to try and understand what took place here. As you head down, and you can see here some of the original pictures of the dig that took place by Nachman Avigad in 1967. I'm reminding you of what was here. In 1948, on the 28th of May, those Jews that were still alive left by foot, and others were carried on stretcher, those that were unwell. And then you had, unfortunately, the burial that took place of the soldiers as well who had died here. We left the old city for 19 years. The Jordanians ruled this area, and they destroyed the area of the Jewish quarter where we now are. Most of the buildings were toppled, the synagogues were burnt, our history laid in ruins. But in 1967, we decided that we were going to rebuild the Jewish quarter after coming back here. But what, you just come and rebuild? That's what you do? But then the archaeologists took an idea, and they said as follows: you know what? Let's check. In the Tekufah, in the period of the Mishnah and the Talmud, were they telling us how Yerushalayim really looked? Let's have a look at our sources, and let's try and dig and find. So they dug down underneath the layer of rubble that the Jordanians had left, and they started to dig down layer by layer in order to piece together the story of what we're about to tell. We are below street level today. And so much of what is taking place in the Jewish quarter, when you go down under street level, you're opening up a whole new world. And the world has to be decided by the archaeologist. How far down he'll go. Will he go to the First Temple period? And that, in effect, means he's going to destroy the Second Temple period, get rid of it to get to the First Temple period. Or will he stop at the Second Temple period and get rid of the period above it? He'll get rid of the Byzantine period, the Ottoman period, and all the other periods that we know. Every place had its decision. We stand in Second Temple Jerusalem. This place, when Nachman Avigad came here, they found this, an iron spear. When they dated it as well as the pottery, they realized, oh my gosh, we have now arrived not just at the Second Temple period, but at the period that we deal with today. The period that we're dealing with over the 3 weeks from the 17th of Tammuz until the 9th of Av. The period of the destruction of the Second Temple period. Remember, the First Temple, its walls were destroyed on the 9th of Tammuz, a month before. but we commemorate it all on the 17th of Tammuz, when the Romans entered into the city, broke through the siege that had started 4 months before. They came through into the city, and then 3 weeks later they will destroy the temple. But we are not standing on the 9th of Av. We're actually standing on the 8th of Elul, 1 month later. Because the upper city where we are now, even though I'm below street level, was destroyed then. The spear tells a story of the family that may have lived here. A story of so many families. A story of division. A story of one of those things that we know from the Talmud, which talks about the idea of why the Second Temple was destroyed. Alidei sinat chinam, because there was baseless hatred. People did not know how to get along with one another. And when you come into the burnt house, you understand that clearly. Because as you start to open the story and follow it through, you realize what a divided people we really were. Nachman Avigad dug away the layers, found the pottery, started to brush away the earth and the dust to be able to uncover for us this story. Who was here? So if I lead you to this window over here, there is an incredible find that we have here. And the find that we have here, one here, and this set that you can see over here as well, they're clearly, when we look at them, we work out exactly what they are, because they look very similar to what we know today. At least what we used to know. If you remember the scales, and you would put on a weight one after the other and tip the scale, these are weights at that time that we have over here. Weights that would have checked the produce that people were bringing. So who was this person who was living here? Was this somebody who had a market stall? Well, no, because we found this. As you can see over here, and if the camera can actually zoom in on this, you can see there's writing here. And the writing, it says as follows: Bare or Bar Katros. Now we know that name. If I open up Pesachet Pesachim, Nun Zayin Amud Bet, if I'm not mistaken, you will find that name. And it's not a name that is totally given a lot of praise, because it's a name that we know of a group of Kohanim. From Beitos all the way down to Katros and some other names in the middle. It's a name that we know from the last 70 years of the Beit HaMikdash, of the temple standing. This family were Kohanim Gedolim, were the high priests. 4 times out of those last 70 years. It's a name that we know when the Talmud says, woe to the people who were part of this family and other parts of other families that were connected to this family. Remember, towards the end of the Second Temple, so much was going wrong. It was so corrupt. We were under the Romans that had walked in 110 years beforehand. They'd arrived to Jerusalem. They were invited in by the Hasmoneans. There was civil war. After having that glorious idea of the Maccabim in 220 CE, we then have this whole period where brothers are fighting each other. And one invites and the other invites, and the Romans just walk in. One thought they were going to help them, the other one thought they were going to help them, but the Romans, of course, had their own interest. And when they arrived to this place over here, they would develop, of course, relations with people. And those people who unfortunately sometimes were blinded by power and by wealth were closest to them. We find the first Kohen HaGadol of this family, just after the time of Herod, is appointed by the Romans, and this continues on. One of them is very close to Pontius Pilate, another very famous Roman governor that was here in Israel at the time. This family itself, we also know from one of our kinot. Because in the kinah which deals with the story of a terrible scene that's taking place in the first temple period. And therefore we know of that story. What Eicha of Jeremiah, of Yirmiyahu is telling us. The book of Lamentations. There's a pasuk in there which we never know how to deal with. Of women that boiled children to eat them because severe was the hunger here in Jerusalem. Now again, we don't take that as literal, but it's showing us of how severe Jerusalem's hunger was. But what we do know, and in the Kinah it mentions, is this. The Romans took a member of the family, the original name of Baitos, and took the member of the family, one of the women, tied her hair to the tail of the hair of the horse, and dragged her through the streets of Jerusalem. That idea, we know of so many other ideas that are connected to that. It follows us all the way through to probably stories that you've heard of the Holocaust, where unfortunately rabbis and other influential people were tied to the back of cars or the back of horses or the back of chariots by the Nazis and driven at high speed through town, murdering them, humiliating them and the family. I stand here then, clearly, if these are the artifacts that were found here by Nachman Avigad, in a house of the Kohanim, in the upper city. We know they lived here in the upper city. We know that they had their life here and they're wealthy, as opposed to what's taking place in the lower city. The Kohanim themselves, some of them were incredible, and others, as we said, unfortunately, had maybe lost their way a little bit. Their wealth is so dramatic that when you see different houses in the Jewish quarter, and one of those things that you're going to see now on screen is the beautiful mosaics and the mikveh which were in people's houses, in the Herodian mansions. You understand they had their own private mikvahot. What were they doing having their own private mikvahot, their own private ritual baths? Why couldn't they go to the regular place? So you have to remember now something which we can now see over here. This mishkolot, this weight that you see over here, are made of stone, as is all of these vessels that you can see here. The reason that we have it is from Masechet Kelim. It talks about the idea that stone does not contact impurity. Now remember, a Kohen who walks through the regular streets and he goes to the mikveh in a regular mikveh has the possibility of meeting somebody who is impure. And therefore, if he goes there, he may not be able to continue his service in the temple that was standing at the time. That is why you find in so many of the places a lot of mikvahot, a lot of ritual baths that were spread around in the upper part of the city. One of them in the Herodian mansions. I'm sure there was one in this house too. But we just don't have it any longer because of the destruction that took place here. We see over here, as you look at this place over here and you see the kli over here, the vessel over here at the back, and those two handles are so familiar to us. And it's an amazing thing. I stand in a house which is 2,000 years old. I stand in a house now of what we know being a Kohen's house. And when I look at the kli, that stone vessel, again, that won't contact impurity, I understand that I'm standing in a house of the vessel that is being used then is exactly the same vessel that I use today. This is the vessel, of course, for netilat yadayim, to wash your hands before you eat bread, when you get up in the morning, after going to the bathroom, using this vessel to wash our hands. It's an amazing thing that links me to understand something. There are so many things, unfortunately. The temple was destroyed in 70 CE. And then what next? How do you carry on? How do you continue on the journey? I've lost everything that was meant to be, for me, kadosh, holy. How do I manage to continue the journey? So we all know the famous story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who manages to rebuild Judaism by going out of the sieged city and requests, "Ten li Yavna v'chachameha," give me the town of Yavna and its wise people. Manages to do that and rebuilds Judaism from that time period. One minhag after the next, one custom after the next, one Jewish law he brings back after the next. He changes the possibility for us to do certain things outside of the temple, but to be able to allow us to continue functioning as Jews. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish High Court, moves out and continues up towards the Galilee. And finally, Jewish life is restored again. That means that you and me are able to continue with our Jewish life even without the temple. Something that people believed was impossible beforehand. Temple is gone, Judaism is dead. But the Jewish neshama, the Jewish spirit and the Jewish soul is much stronger than just a building. When you see this over here, you understand that concept of us being that link in the chain. One link after the next, after the next. We are connected all the way back to this family over here. We are connected even further back, even though we haven't found Kalim from before. But there's a good possibility they were using the same style then. You go into a shop today, you buy your new kli, your new vessel for Netilat Yadayim, to wash your hands. You're connecting yourselves all the way back to the halakha that's written then. What we managed to do, the Mesirut Nefesh, the concept of sacrificing so much to hold on to Jewish ideals. You know, I remember meeting a woman in Golders Green, told us a story. So Rabbi Naftali Schiff, my partner in JRoots, told us a story of what took place on the train to Auschwitz. They arrive after a long journey from the Carpathian Mountains to Auschwitz. And the ramp, as we all know, once the door was open, was awaiting them. SS guards were on the ramp. Dogs are barking at them. The Nazis were shouting and screaming out orders. And they were all exhausted from the journey. She turns to her father, who says to her this, "Please do me a favor." And he takes out of his pocket some money. "Get me some water." She realizes that after 3 days, he has been giving his water and all his rations to his kids to keep them alive. And now he's physically and mentally exhausted. He needs some water to rejuvenate himself to get off the train. She gets off, she finds somebody in one of these striped uniforms who we now know is a ramp commando. Asks for some water, he digs around in the bag, gives her the water. She gets back on the train. Unbelievable that she was able to get back to the carriage. She sees her father in the carriage, still has not come down from the carriage. She gives him the water, and then she sees what he does. Because you and me now expect him to open the bottle and take a gulp of that water to be able to rejuvenate himself. But he pours it into a cup to be able to do Negel Wasser, Netilat Yadayim. Because he hasn't done it that morning, so he couldn't pray. And then starts to put his tefillin on until the Nazis saw this and beat him to a pulp. That was the last mitzvah that she saw her father do. The last beautiful Jewish idea that was linking us all the way back. Here at the cup that you see over here and the cup that would have been in the ramp in Auschwitz. That chain of one Jew after the next, holding on to what it meant to have their mitzvot, their commandments that kept them every single day, holding on to that beauty of the Jewish people. We look around over here and there's something which you would find in many other houses, but not in Jewish houses. And therefore you don't find them here, and that of course is idolatry. A lot of people were carrying these charms of different sort of symbols of the Greeks at the time. We don't have that, but we do have something else over here. And if you look at these small little vases over here, they're called perfume bottles, as you call them. We know them as being something called teardrop vases. These teardrop vases tell another story. Yes, they were filled with perfume. And the wife or the daughters of the house would have used them Just like a perfume bottle, a Chanel or whatever else it may be today, that would be used in our houses back home. But there's another reason that they have them. All over Jerusalem, there are a lot of tombs. And those tombs were opened in order to be able to add the next part of the family into the tomb who had passed away. They usually had their own caves with a big type of stone in front of the cave to block it. They would then, when somebody would die, would push that aside and they would bury the next person. But the stench of death, unfortunately, was still very strong because it was a cave. They would take these, chuck them at the stone so they would explode. The perfume would then obviously give a nicer smell and they'd be able to open the stone. That's what we know at one time. But then there's another story that takes place. And I think it links us into the next room that we're about to go into. It's told to us that Jewish women use these vases, as you can see, these perfume bottles that look like a drop. And they called them teardrop vases because they would cry into them at the suffering that they were going through. And as the Romans were coming through town, they would take their teardrop vases and chuck them at the Roman carriages, showing them the sorrow and the pain of what the people were feeling at the time. That pain is felt when you come into this room over here too. Because as we enter into this room, we now see the archaeology of what there was then. We see this is the basement of their family, Kachos family over here. We know that because, again, we found something. But there's some other stuff that we found here which is incredible. They're a family of Kohanim, and generally the Kohanim did not fight the battle. They didn't agree with the Kanaim, with the Zealots. They wanted to come to some type of diplomacy with the Romans. Or should I say, they may have been, many of them, in the pocket of the Romans, for a lot of them. But the Kachos family themselves wanted to be able still to be connected to what was taking place here. And we find that in all sorts of things. Coins that were found here. On the first coin it said the first year of the rebellion, L'Geulat Yerushalayim, for the redemption of Jerusalem. And so on and so on and so forth, until in 69 CE when they printed the fourth year, that was the last types of coins that we found here. So we know that they were destroyed and they were killed, unfortunately, in the Churban, because we don't find any coins afterwards. Because remember, just because Yerushalayim had fallen, the rebellion had not ended. The rebellion will only end 3 years later in Masada. And so there would have been other coins that could well have been printed. L'Geulat Yerushalayim, to redeem Jerusalem. It's an amazing thing that was the coin base that we have today. You think about your notes that you have wherever you're watching this from around the world. Who's on the note? What story does it tell? Who's on the coin? What picture? What does it want to give you that message? The message of everything that took place in Yerushalayim. From Gamla in 66 CE and Yotfat in the Galil. Gamla was in the Golan, Yotfat was in the Galil, all led by a Kohen at the time, the rebellion, by a man who we know today, with his English name, Josephus Flavius, whose Hebrew name was Yosef ben Mattatyahu. He was unsuccessful there. But as Shmariyahu Gutman tells us in the Golan, I couldn't understand. What were they doing rebelling against the Romans? Why were they rebelling in the Golan Heights, so far away? What were they doing? And then he found the coin. And the coin said, L'Geulat Yerushalayim, to redeem Jerusalem. Everything is focused in on this. Everything is focused in on the place that we're in. Everything, all of our lives, just like as Masechet Brachot talks about this idea of we all pray to one direction, towards the Temple Mount, towards the Kodesh HaKadoshim, where the Holy of Holies stood. If you're standing in the south, you're standing in the north, you're standing in the east and the west, you look towards the same direction. It could be west, it could be east, it could be north, it could be south. But you head towards Yerushalayim. All our prayers go up in one place. L'geulat Yerushalayim, to redeem Jerusalem. And that's why even after Jerusalem had been destroyed, that hope was never lost. Think about it. Even later on, 62 years after the reign of the Romans, after the fact they destroyed Jerusalem, we're in the midst of a massive campaign of Bar Kokhba, who again is fighting not just for sovereignty, not just for independence, but he's fighting for Geulat Yerushalayim, to redeem Jerusalem. It's a fight that hasn't been lost till today. That concept of putting Jerusalem into our heart to understand how important it is to us. I can't imagine what it was like for this family as they opened their windows one day on the 9th of Av and they saw the temple burning. The Kohen who was living here, his family of Kohanim that were living here, a group of people that had been dedicated to the temple, to going to serve God at the temple. All of a sudden, all their dreams are shattered. And as I said, 1 month later, they came up the Romans and destroyed them physically too. Spiritually, they had been downtrodden already. But now physically, they were going to be murdered by the Romans. And they didn't care who you were. They came through the city, killing as many people as possible. I can only imagine it just like the first Crusades, where it talks about the people were wading under human blood up to their knees at the time. The Romans were doing the same thing at that time. When they came into this building over here, you can see the charred remains down in the bottom over here of the building that would have had obviously a second floor, which is now no longer here, which we can't see today. But when Nachman Avigad came here, one of the things they found was an arm that was outstretched. And that arm had fingers on the end of a woman who had been murdered here by the Romans in the house of the Kohanim that we have here. You can see though here, even though we're now in the basement, the wealth of what this place had. And that wealth itself of a Kohen that lived here in Yerushalayim, telling us a story of what Yerushalayim was like in its heyday. But that beauty is stones. Stones don't mean much to us. They tell a story. I can piece together some ideas from stones. But we have to understand the messages behind the stones. You're living in the upper city. You're cut off from the rest of the people. You barely had contact with them. And so it is a surprise that there were so many different views and so many different ideas, and the Kohanim stood on one side of those ideas, known as the Sadducees, who really didn't have much contact with what was taking place with other people. We know how divided we are. We know that we don't always get along with certain people. We know that all groups of Judaism, they have their own things they stand for, and they don't necessarily know how to mesh and mold together. We're in Israel at the present moment. You've all followed the politics in Israel. You know about what's taken place over the last few weeks here as well. But our hope has to be that we learn the messages from behind us. Our hope has to be that we ourselves can rise above that concept of machloket, of argument. Our hope has to be that case, that word that is soaring over Jerusalem, which is the word of shalom, peace. But that peace has to be beini v'beincha, between me and between you. Because don't expect another building to be built until we can understand to be able to work this out together. Yerushalayim nechrav, it was destroyed because we didn't know how to speak to each other. We didn't know how to work with each other. We didn't know how to interact. How to understand somebody who didn't agree and believe in the same things that I do. And vice versa. How can it be that so many Tisha B'Avs, so many 9th of Avs have gone past, one after the other after the other, and we still haven't learned? The message has to be the picture that you see behind you of the destruction of Second Temple period Jerusalem. And for us to take those messages and really work on ourselves about it.